I'm Renee Maloney, and welcome to my senior thesis documentary. I got into theater because when I was 5 years old, my sister was in a production of Annie. I wanted to be my sister so bad in that moment that I decided the second I was able to, I was going to join our theater. My theater journey does not start with acting. I was incredibly stage fright when I was young, and so I didn't want to act. Instead of auditioning for a role, I asked our theater director if I could do anything else that didn't require me to be on stage. She said yes, of course, and she put me on the crew. I was on the crew throughout elementary and middle school, and when I got to high school, I started acting. I really loved acting, but towards the end of my senior year, I decided that I wanted to do stage management. While I had been acting for 4 years, I had a lot of stage fright my senior year. So when I was applying to different theater programs, it was important to me that I didn't have to do an audition. I was okay with an interview, but something about getting on stage and singing in front of a bunch of people I didn't know really made me nervous, and so I looked for theater programs that allowed me to interview rather than audition. Xavier was one of those schools. I came to Xavier on February 29th for my interview, and luckily that same evening I was accepted into the program. Something that drew me to the Xavier Theater Department was that I would be able to stage manage, or at least assistant stage manage, the first semester that I was here. I was super excited about this prospect, as all the other colleges that I had auditioned for said that there would be no option but to wait until the end of your freshman year or even the beginning of your sophomore year to be part of the theater. And I wanted to dive headfirst into stage management. Freshman year, the first show that I stage managed was Behind the Screens. As we were in the middle of COVID, we were unable to do stage productions, so we came up with a virtual new film festival as a way to keep making art. I was a part of Comeback Productions' performance of Behind the Screens. The show came with a lot of challenges. Our initial design was to do everything in person and to be able to have our actors film with each other. But in the middle of our filming, one of our actors was diagnosed with COVID, and they decided to spend the rest of their semester at home with their family isolating in order to keep from having any further incidents. That meant that we had to change our plan very last minute. We changed from a more in-person production feel to a bit more of a collective or collage approach. We would film with our 3 actors that were in Cincinnati, and we would have our actor who was isolating in Chicago send us videos that we could patch together. But we still wanted that feeling that everyone was together, so we chose to utilize Zoom in order to have shots where all of our actors were together. We wanted to highlight that even in the isolation that we were all feeling with COVID, there were still points in time where we could come together and feel as though we were connected to each other. I also had many successes with this show. This was the first show that I had stage managed, and so I was really excited to get to learn a lot of new things. I got to work with a bunch of new paperwork, like a daily call and rehearsal report. I also learned how to thoroughly and clearly communicate with my production team. My biggest takeaway from this show is that flexibility is key. Changes are going to happen, and you need to be able to roll with the punches as they come. The next show I did was Something Borrowed, Someone Blue. Something Borrowed, Someone Blue is a choose-your-own-adventure Zoom show. The cast of over 20 people, 9 of which wrote the show. The show would start out in one big Zoom room and split into 4 different breakout rooms. Each breakout room had a different cast following a different storyline that ran throughout the show. The audience would then be put into the breakout room so that they could witness parts of the show. The audience was allowed to hop between breakout rooms in order to see different parts of the show. While this was a lot to oversee, this did bring in one of my major successes of the show, which was communication. I was communicating with the entire cast through GroupMe. I had table heads, which were the lead actors in each table, in one GroupMe. I would give them a go over GroupMe, and they would give their cast individual goes so that they would know when to start the scene. I was also communicating with my ASM, Anna Colley, who acted as a board op for this show. I had to give her cues, which was something I had never done before, and I had to make sure that all of my cues for Anna and my actors lined up. This meant that I had to make sure that I was communicating with Anna and my actors all at once so that the cues would line up. My biggest takeaway from this show is fake it till you make it. I had never stage managed a show like this, and Zoom theater was still very new, so there was no real guidelines for how I was meant to do anything. That meant that I made a lot of stuff on the fly while also trying to follow the same routine that you would for a normal on-stage production. Sophomore year. American Idiot was the first on-stage production that I was involved in at Xavier. Myself and Abby Shear were ASMs under Lauren Davidson. This was new to me. I had never ASM'd before, so I had no idea what I was going to be doing during rehearsals or performances, as the entire concept was really new to me. Even though the plan was to return to the next semester completely unmasked, during the early days of rehearsal, COVID started spiking again, and we found out that we would have to be masked for the rest of the semester. I got to learn a lot during this show. I got to work with a bunch of new paperwork I had never seen before, I had to work with a shift plot, which tracks where props and set pieces go throughout a performance. That meant that I had to be aware of everything that was happening on stage during rehearsals. Another fun thing I got to learn was how to cue a fly rail. I was going to have to communicate with Sarah Maloney, who was at the other end of the fly rail. That meant that there was no way I was going to be able to tell her when to go, so I instead had to give her a visual cue. While I had to communicate with Sarah, who was on the other end of the fly rail, I also had to make sure that the actors weren't getting in the way of Sarah seeing me. Another thing that I had to work with during the show was masks. There's a lot of different things happening in each aspect of the show, and so every now and again an actor would forget to put a mask on. This meant that I had to remind some actors that they needed to put a mask on for safety. My biggest takeaway from American Idiot is if you think you can't do something, you won't. During American Idiot, I dealt with a lot of self-doubt. I had never ASM'd before, and I saw all the amazing work that Abby and Lauren were doing, and I was worried that I wasn't living up to the same standards that they were. But I knew that if I didn't try, then I would never succeed in what I was doing. So even when I thought something was too hard or that I wasn't able to do something because I didn't have the foreknowledge of how to do it, I still had to try my hardest. The next show I did was Mamma Mia. I came into Mamma Mia 4 days after American Idiot closed. That was a quick turnaround time, but it was still 2 weeks after Mamma Mia had already started their rehearsals. I was also coming into a new team, so with that came a lot of nerves. I was worried that they would have set ways of doing things that I wouldn't understand, and that I would be behind on some aspect of the show. But I now had a newfound confidence in being an ASM, so I was ready for whatever was thrown my way. I had to work on new pieces of paperwork like a vocal tracker and a French scene breakdown, which tracked less set and props and more people and movement. This is where my love of paperwork came out of. I like to know where things are and how things work backstage, so a lot of that came through in my paperwork. I started to find my love of paperwork. I love knowing exactly where everything is. I wanted to make sure that I was tracking everything for Josie, so I became very detailed in my tracking of individuals' movement. I also wanted to make sure that my vocal tracking was right, so sometimes during our rehearsals, I would walk backstage just to make sure that everyone who I thought was going to be singing in a scene was. My biggest takeaway from Mamma Mia is to take opportunities as they come to you. I asked to join Mamma Mia. I knew it would be rough coming off of a show and straight onto another show, but I wanted to be able to work on as many processes as I could in order to better learn how to be an ASM and a stage manager in preparation for the next semester. The next show that I got to work on was Proof. Proof was part of the Rep series, which was 3 shows that ran at the same time. Even though cases of COVID had started to die down during the spring semester, our cast was hit by COVID. Overall, we had 24 rehearsals, 12 of which had to be held on Zoom. That meant that in the 12 days that we were in person, we had to get a lot of stuff done. We had 12 days to block the entire show, so all the character building and line learning needed to happen during our Zoom rehearsals. Another major challenge that we faced happened during Tech Week. The Wednesday before Tech Week, we ended up having a major snowstorm that closed the university down for almost 3 days. Because we were part of the Rep series, all 3 shows would be teching at the same time. In the original tech schedule, Proof was going to be teching 11 to 3 on the Saturday and Sunday of tech. This changed on Friday once we found out that we were clear to be at the university for the weekend. While Proof didn't need much tech to begin with, I was still really nervous to only have 1 day to tech a show, as I had never called a show before, and I was worried that I wouldn't get enough practice in beforehand. We ended up having the entire show teched on the first day. While Proof brought a lot of challenges, it also brought a lot of successes. This was the first show that I ever got to call. I got to call the show from the catwalks, which presented its own set of challenges, namely the fact that I'm not a quiet person by nature, and the audience was sitting directly under me, so I had to be very conscious of my volume. But calling the show was a really exciting part of stage management that I hadn't really been able to see in the same light. My biggest takeaway from Proof is that it's okay to not know things. I was worried that I would be expected to know how everything works, and that I wouldn't be able to have any grace throughout the process. Luckily, everyone that I worked with during the show was amazing, and they were all very patient as I learned how to do things for the first time. The next show that I worked on was Once. During Once, there was a lot of things that needed to be tracked. The show takes place on a very small stage, but there's a lot that happens. Despite Once being a small show, there's a lot of things for the stage management team to be doing. We had a lot of things that needed to be tracked, and as paperwork was one of my favorite things, I took on the job of tracking everything. During rehearsals, I would have 4 different Excel sheets pulled up at the same time. I had a French scene breakdown, a vocal tracker, an instrument breakdown, and an instrument tracker to make sure that we knew where everything and everyone was throughout the entire show. Most of the actors played 2 to 3 instruments, but some played even more than that. However, we only had a limited amount of instruments, so we had to make sure that we knew where everything was. That meant if a guitar got picked up, taken across stage, and sat down on a bar, we had to make sure that we knew it was going to be on that bar for the next actor's entrance. Even though it was stressful to do at the time, Looking back at it now, the information was very helpful for our production team and helped us have a smoother flow of the show. And one of the biggest challenges we had during once was the flooring. We had taped out the set in the studio and had been working in the studio for most of the rehearsals. Once we finally moved on stage, myself, Josie Daly, and Maddie C. Plack had to take measurements of where all the spike tape lied on stage and translate it over into the main stage theater. I think we spiked the floor 3 or 4 times before the flooring was entirely laid. My biggest takeaway from once is the more that you put in, the more that you get out. While I found it stressful to try and track absolutely everything on stage, I knew that I had to put my full effort into it. I couldn't do half of it and call it good. I needed to make sure that the work I was putting in was reflecting the effort that all of the actors and the rest of the production team was putting in. Rabbit Hole has a lot of unique challenges, both as a production and for me personally. My first challenge in the show was I was not going to be there for the majority of the first 2 weeks of rehearsal. I was going to be in RA training and rehearsals were going to be happening at the same time. That meant that I had to leave my ASM, Reese Niederhausen, in charge of rehearsals. Some of the challenges that come with the actual production of the show is that there's a lot of props. In our specific scenic design, the entire upstage portion of our stage was a child's bedroom. In total, there were over 200 individual toys that were on stage. One of the unique aspects of Rabbit Hole is that there's a lot of intimacy, both written in the stage directions and implied. That meant that we brought in an intimacy coordinator to help coach our actors. We worked a lot with our intimacy coordinator, Angelique Archer, to make sure that all of the intimacy was readable to the audience, but also was comfortable for our actors to perform every night. One of my biggest takeaways from Rabbit Hole is that tap-ins and tap-outs are for everyone. I became incredibly emotionally burnt out. I was tired, and witnessing my friends go through this incredibly intense show every night started to take a toll on me. Even though I knew they were acting, it is still hard to watch your friends go through this every night, and I started to feel emotionally burnt out towards the end of the show. And I finally understood what Angelique meant when she said tap-outs were for everyone. The next show I worked on was Our Town. One of the biggest challenges that came with Our Town was that there were a lot of conflicts. Several of the actors had jobs that ran during our rehearsal times. That meant that we would have to rely on our understudies to come in and fill in the gaps throughout the week. Another interesting part of the show was the fact that everyone was going to be seen. The show was going to take place on the main stage theater with 2 rows of audience members running parallel to the stage. That meant that the actors had to be aware that there was going to be an audience on every side of them. Another interesting part of the set design was that we wanted the entire backstage to be seen. That meant that all the crew members, including the ASMs, myself, and our lightboard op, would be seen by the audience. Myself and our lightboard op, Matthew Callis, were going to be put on a platform and tucked into a corner so that we could see the entire stage as actions were happening. We created the effect of snow falling using snow bags. A snow bag is a piece of canvas that is draped from 2 different pipes with holes cut into it so that when you pull the pipes up and down with the fly rail, the snow falls out of it as though it's falling from the sky. It's a very neat effect to have in a show, but it can very easily get messed up. Throughout the tech process and throughout our first 3 shows, the snow went off without a hitch. During our final show, one of the fly rail operators lost his grip on one of the ropes and ended up dumping 15 pounds of fake snow all at once. But that leads to my takeaway. The show must go on. There were so many different things that happened during the performance that I thought would mess things up, but we truly just had to keep rolling and make it through the shows. The next show that I did was 9 to 5. 9 to 5 was the first musical that I ever stage managed. I hadn't been on a musical in over a year, so I felt a little out of my element as I didn't really know what it took to stage manage a musical, but I figured I would face it head on. One of the biggest challenges with 9 to 5 was the transitions. We didn't have any set pieces until we got to Tech Week, so even though we had been miming out what we thought the transitions were going to be, actually having the full set and all of the set pieces and different elements that were going to be involved proved to be a much bigger challenge. So even though we had been miming out transitions throughout the rehearsal process, we didn't know what transitions were going to look like until we had all the pieces in place. That meant that there were a lot of transitions that we were unprepared for, as we didn't know the amount of manpower that it would take to do one transition. Even though we had a cast of about 25 people and nearly 10 crew members, each scene change required that every person be on hand. I was unaware of how big transitions were going to be, and so while I had a shift plot planned out, my shift plot was not nearly detailed enough to account for everything that we were going to be needing to do throughout every transition. I remember Stephen coming up to me during rehearsal and asking if I needed help or if I had the transitions covered. I remember thinking there was no way that I could tech a show and safely facilitate all of the scene changes. Something was going to be forgotten, and that one way or the other, something was going to end up being a safety hazard. So I told Steven that I needed help. My biggest success during 9 to 5 was that I got back up and I kept going. Having just come off of Our Town and remembering that the show must go on, I knew that even when things felt like they were too big and that everything was going to be too difficult, I needed to keep going. My biggest takeaway from 9 to 5 is actually something that Aaron Rossini, the director of Our Town, told me. It's rehearsal class. You're here at a college to learn. Tech is my time to learn just as much as rehearsals are an actor's time to learn. And I had to be okay with taking that space for myself. Senior year. The first show that I worked on my senior year was The Sound of Music. The Family Weekend musical is typically the largest musical that Xavier will put on in a season. I had a cast of 30 and 4 minors that were involved on the show, totaling 34 cast members. This was by far the biggest show that I had ever worked on. In order to prepare for the challenges ahead, Stephen and I decided that I should have 4 ASMs in order to help facilitate the show. We were going to split up the child wrangling duties amongst the 4 ASMs so that way no one person would get burnt out by taking care of children every day during rehearsal. Ultimately, plans shifted. I ended up having 5 ASMs total, 3 of them taking on different roles throughout the process, 2 of them remaining as just ASMs. One of my challenges that turned into a success was the way that I was communicating. Because of the size of the cast, almost every principal actor had an understudy, but all of the understudies were in the ensemble. That meant if we were calling principal actors and the ensemble at different portions of rehearsal, I had to make sure that I was calling all of the right actors to the right scenes and at the right time. My biggest takeaway from The Sound of Music is to ask for help when you need it and to accept help when it is offered. I don't like asking for help. I often think I can do everything by myself and that I don't need help from others. But I knew that in a show like The Sound of Music, that was not going to be true. I was going to have to ask for help, and I was going to have to accept that even if I thought I could do everything, I need to be able to rely on my 5 ASMs for helping me with different things throughout the shows. The next show that I worked on, or more so the next series of show that I worked on, was the Student Showcase. I was an assistant producer along with Kristen Fries and Allie Linzer. Originally, each of us was going to take a show, and that would be the show that we would assistant produce. However, during further conversations, we came to realize that myself and Kristen Fries would both be absent for part of tech rehearsals. We didn't want to leave 2 shows without an assistant producer, so we decided that all 3 of us would work on all 3 shows together. One of my main roles throughout this time was budget tracking. I kept track of all 3 budgets and gave out regular updates so that everyone involved in the production team could know just how much of the budget was left. As we got into tech, myself, Kristen Fries, and Allie Linzer all took on different roles. The show that I assisted with the most was The Moors. During tech for The Moors, I sat next to the stage manager, Allison Dybel, in order to assist her in learning the different things that a stage manager needs to do during a tech. I helped Allison take charge of her tech rehearsals. I wanted to help Allison take the space that she needed in order to run the best show that she could. Sometimes that meant that I told her exactly what to say in order to facilitate moving on to the next spot, but other times it just meant that I told her the best way I thought that she could call a cue. Ultimately, I was incredibly proud of Allison and the work that she produced during this show. I saw that Allison had a drive to learn and to do the absolute best job she could, and I really admired that. During NPC and the choreographer showcase, I was more hands-off. Prom had begun rehearsals, and so I was unable to be in the room as much as I was for The Moors. But in the times that I was able to be in rehearsals, during the times I was able to be in rehearsals and production meetings, I wanted to facilitate doing anything that I could to help. If that meant that I had to teach a crew member how to properly sweep and mop a stage, then that's what I would do. If it meant that I was going to be moving some spike tape around so that the actors knew where the center of the stage would be, then that's what I would do. But I wanted to make sure that all 3 shows were going to be running as smoothly as possible in a backstage aspect. The biggest takeaway from the Student Showcase comes from working with Allison. Allison wanted to learn how to become the best version of a stage manager that she could be. That meant that Allison was constantly asking questions. She wanted to make sure that she knew exactly what was going on and that even if she messed up along the way, she was going to continue trying. The next show that I worked on was The Prom, but you'll hear plenty more of that during my oral presentation. The final show that I worked on during my time at Xavier was John Proctor's The Villain. I was an ASM under Allie Linzer. One of my biggest challenges during John Proctor's The Villain was going back to an ASM role. I hadn't been an ASM for almost 2 years, so I was afraid that I would come into this show and I would step on Allie's toes in some way. and that was the absolute last thing I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that I was assisting Allie, not taking over for her. I wanted to empower Allie throughout the show, and sometimes that meant that I had to remind the cast that even if I knew the answer to something, that they were meant to ask Allie those types of questions. Some of the successes that I had during the show was in my taking on of new roles. I remember back to my time during American Idiot, I didn't know the role of an ASM, and I was really kind of clueless as to what I needed to be doing during rehearsal. In remembering that, I took on a bit of a leadership role in order to guide Caleb and Norm. My takeaway is that you'll never know everything, and that there is always an opportunity to learn. At this point in time, I had stage managed 8 different shows at Xavier, and I had ASM'd 3. So many people would think that I've learned it all, but that's simply untrue. You can always be learning from your peers. As I sat next to Allie during tech rehearsals, I watched as she communicated with designers and actors. You should always be learning and always be growing, especially at a collegiate theater program, which is exactly what I came to Xavier to do. So what's next for me? Currently, I don't have any direct plans following graduation. My main plan is to go home and take a break. I have been involved with 15 different processes during my time at Xavier. For the last 3 years, I have also been a resident assistant. I've been doing a lot of things in a lot of different ways, and I've been working on helping others throughout this whole time. After college, I want to focus on helping me. I want to take a break, and if that means that I have to take a break and I have to go home, then that's what that means. I've also applied for a hall director position at Xavier. While this wouldn't be the break that I've intended for myself, I have quite a bit of experience managing people, and being a hall director utilizes my skills as both a stage manager and an RA, and brings them together in a nice, lovely package. So maybe I become a hall director after graduation, or maybe I go home. Regardless, I am incredibly proud of the work that I have done to better my skills and to make an impact on the Xavier community.